She had practiced the Duchess's smile for 3 weeks in front of a cracked mirror. The slight tilt of the chin, the cool lift of one brow, the way wealth makes a woman look at the world as though it owes her something. By the time the iron gates of Harrowfield Manor swung open and the carriage wheels crunched over frosted gravel, even she had almost forgotten who she really was. Almost. The scar, however, never forgot. The winter of 1873 arrived in Harrowfield County the way bad news always does, quietly and all at once. Snow had begun to fall 3 days before Christmas, burying the Lancashire-style stone walls of the manor in white silence, smoothing over the jagged edges of the countryside until everything looked clean and composed and utterly deceptive. The servants had lined the entrance hall in 2 rows by the time the carriage door opened, their breath rising in pale columns in the frozen air, their faces arranged into the careful blankness of people trained never to look too long at anything. The woman who stepped out was dressed in deep burgundy wool, her collar trimmed with dark fur, a small velvet hat pinned at a precise angle over copper-brown hair. She moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had never once been told to hurry, one gloved hand accepting the footman's assistance not with gratitude but with the mild tolerance of a woman accustomed to being helped. She paused at the top of the stone steps and looked out over the estate with gray-green eyes that swept the ground slowly, deliberately, the way a general surveys unfamiliar terrain before committing to a plan. Her name, according to every document in the leather traveling case now being carried inside by a breathless young porter, was Constance Ashford, Duchess of Harrowfield, recently returned from 8 months abroad following a period of personal grief. The staff had been told she had changed. Grief does that to a person, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Clara Dunning, had murmured to the younger maids that morning, folding her hands with the authority of someone who had survived 4 decades of other people's sorrows. Do not stare. Do not ask questions. Welcome her home and make her comfortable. And so they did. What none of them noticed, what none of them were positioned to notice, was the way Constance Ashford's eyes moved when she crossed the threshold of Harrowfield Manor for the very first time. Not the careful gaze of a woman returning to a familiar place with fresh grief in her chest, but the quick, involuntary scan of someone mapping a room they have never stood in before. The location of the exits, the placement of the staff, the distance between the entrance and the grand staircase. The look of a woman who had spent years knowing exactly how fast she could run. She caught herself, smoothed her expression, and smiled at Mrs. Dunning with a warmth precisely calibrated to feel genuine. "It is good to be home," she said. Her voice was perfect, low, measured, faintly musical, identical to the recordings she had made in her memory after listening to the real Constance speak at 3 separate public engagements over the course of a year. She had studied the woman the way a scholar studies a dead language, obsessively, privately, with the knowledge that a single mispronunciation could be fatal. Mrs. Dunning pressed both hands to her heart. "We have missed you terribly, Your Grace. The manor hasn't been the same." "I imagine not," the woman said, and turned toward the staircase before the housekeeper could search her face too carefully. Her room, Constance's room, was on the 2nd floor, east wing, overlooking a snow-covered garden that in warmer months would have been filled with roses. Someone had placed fresh white flowers on the writing desk, and a fire had been burning long enough to take the chill from the air. She stood in the center of the room after the maid left and simply breathed. Her real name was Violet Crane. She had not said it aloud in 7 months. She set her gloves down on the dresser and caught her reflection in the tall oval mirror, the burgundy dress, the velvet hat, the composed expression that had taken her the better part of a year to perfect. For a moment she studied herself the way she imagined Constance would have, critically, distantly, without particular feeling. Then her gaze dropped, as it always did when she stood too long in front of mirrors, to the left side of her jaw, just below the ear. The scar was faint, barely 2 inches long. A thin, silvery line the color of old moonlight that most people, if they noticed it at all, assumed was nothing more than a childhood accident. She had considered covering it with theatrical powder, with carefully arranged curls, with the precise angle of a hat brim. And she did cover it most of the time, skillfully, consistently. But scars have a way of appearing at the worst possible moments. In the firelight, in morning sunlight through unlined curtains. in the sharp, unguarded glance of someone who has been looking for exactly that mark for a very long time. She did not know yet that the Duke of Hereford had returned to the manor 3 days early. She did not know that he was, at that very moment, standing in the library on the ground floor, turning a glass of brandy slowly in his hand, staring at the fire with the expression of a man reconstructing something he thought he had imagined years ago. A girl, a storm, a scar shaped like a crescent moon just below the left ear. His name was James Hereford. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, and possessed of the kind of stillness that in another man might have read as calm, but in him read as patience, the specific patience of someone who has learned that the truth, if you wait long enough and watch carefully enough, always surfaces on its own. He had not yet gone upstairs to greet his wife. He was thinking. Violet, Constance, sat at the writing desk and opened the leather journal she had been keeping since the beginning. Not a diary, a record. Names, dates, schedules, debts, and the intricate map of a wrong so old and so carefully buried that most people who had been touched by it didn't even know the name of what had been done to them. She uncapped the ink pen, smoothed a fresh page, and at the top wrote 4 words in her own handwriting. The only piece of herself she had never managed to change. Find him. End it. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Hereford Manor, covering everything in white, making the world look clean and composed and utterly deceptive. And downstairs, James Hereford set down his brandy, straightened his coat, and walked toward the stairs. James Hereford did not knock. That was the first thing Violet noticed. Not the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, not the turn of the brass handle, but the absence of hesitation. He opened the door to Constance's room the way a man opens a door in his own house, which of course it was, and stood in the frame with his coat still on and his dark eyes moving across the room in that same slow, measuring way she had noticed in herself only an hour before. She had just enough time to close the journal. "You're back early," she said, and was grateful, deeply, privately grateful, that her voice did not waver. James looked at her for a moment that lasted precisely 1 second too long. Then he stepped inside, pulled off his gloves, and set them on the side table near the door with the careful deliberateness of a man who does everything intentionally. "The roads from Hartford were clear," he said. "I saw no reason to delay." He was taller than she had expected. The portrait in the East Corridor, the one she had memorized along with every other detail of this household before she ever set foot in it, had captured the breadth of his shoulders and the severity of his jaw but had somehow failed to convey the quality of his attention. The way he looked at things, the way he looked at her now, standing near the writing desk with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something she hoped resembled a wife's composed welcome. "You look well," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation, offered in the tone of a man filing information away. 8 months of sea air," Violet replied. "It does wonders." Something shifted in his expression, so briefly she might have imagined it. He moved to the fireplace and stood with his back to her for a moment, one hand resting on the mantel, studying the flames. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people measuring the distance between what is being said and what is being meant. "Mrs. Dunning tells me you arrived this afternoon," he said. "Just before the snow thickened, yes. And the journey from the port? No difficulties. None worth mentioning." He turned then, and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. Not suspicion exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something older and more personal than suspicion. "You cut your hair," he said. Violet's pulse moved precisely once before she controlled it. She had cut it not drastically but enough. A calculated choice, made because the real Constance had worn hers longer, and Violet's own hair, after months of careful growing, still fell 2 inches shorter than the portraits suggested. She had told herself it wouldn't matter, that no husband catalogued his wife's hair length with the precision of a jeweler. She was revising that assumption. "It became unmanageable abroad," she said lightly. "The humidity in Lisbon is unforgiving." He accepted this, or appeared to. He moved away from the fireplace and toward the door, and she exhaled slowly, quietly, through her nose. "Dinner is at 7, he said, pausing in the doorway. "I've asked Mrs. Dunning to keep it informal. I imagine you're tired." "That's very considerate." He nodded once, the way people nod when they are thinking about something else entirely, and left. Violet stood very still until she heard his footsteps reach the end of the corridor. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat against her knees and stared at the middle distance for a long moment. He had not said anything wrong. He had not done anything suspicious. He had been, by every measurable standard, a perfectly reasonable man welcoming a wife home after a long absence. And yet, she picked up the journal again and turned to the page she had written on earlier. Find him. End it. Below those 4 words, she now added a 5th line in a smaller, tighter script. The handwriting of someone making a note they don't want to look at too directly. He already knows something is wrong. Downstairs, James Harrowfield did not go to his study. He went instead to the portrait gallery, the long, cold corridor on the ground floor where the Ashford family lined the walls in gilded frames, generation after generation of composed, pale-eyed aristocracy staring down at the living with the mild contempt of people who no longer had to worry about anything. He walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back, until he reached the most recent portrait, commissioned 2 years ago, just before Constance had departed for the continent. He stood before it for a long time. In the portrait, Constance Ashford wore a pale blue gown and an expression of serene authority. Her hair was pinned elaborately. Her chin was lifted at the precise angle that suggested she had been born knowing she would one day be a duchess. James studied the portrait the way he had studied the woman upstairs. Carefully, systematically, without any visible emotion. Then his gaze moved to the left side of the painted jaw, just below the ear. In the portrait, the skin there was smooth, unmarked. The painter, as painters of that era reliably did, had smoothed away every imperfection with the quiet diplomacy of someone paid to make the nobility look like they had never suffered a day in their lives. James had sat beside Constance at their wedding breakfast. He had danced with her at 3 separate county balls. He had shared 7 years of a marriage that was, by the standards of their class, perfectly functional and entirely bloodless. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had once made a study of such things, that Constance Ashford did not have a scar below her left ear. The woman upstairs did. He turned away from the portrait and walked back toward his study. His footsteps quiet and even on the stone floor, his face giving nothing away to the empty corridor. He did not go to Mrs. Dunning. He did not send for the magistrate. He did not do any of the things a reasonable man in his position might have been expected to do. Instead, he sat down at his desk, opened the top drawer, and removed a letter he had received 6 weeks ago. A letter he had read 4 times and told no one about, from a source he trusted more than he trusted almost anyone alive. He unfolded it now and read the last paragraph once more, as he had read it a dozen times since it arrived. She will come to Harrowfield. I cannot tell you who she is or why she is coming, but I ask you to trust me when I say that her reasons are not what they appear to be. Do not stop her. Do not expose her. Watch her. She is looking for something that belongs to both of you, though she does not yet know your name is part of the story. He refolded the letter, returned it to the drawer, and locked it. Outside the study window, snow was still falling on Harrowfield Manor, silent and relentless, burying the world 1 careful inch at a time. Dinner at 7 was a quiet war conducted entirely through silverware and politeness. The dining room at Harrowfield Manor was long enough that 2 people sitting at opposite ends could, if they chose, pretend they were eating alone. James had asked Mrs. Dunning to keep it informal, which meant only 4 candelabras instead of the usual 8, and only 2 courses instead of 5. It still felt like a performance. The white linen, the bone china, the silver ladle catching the light every time the serving girl moved. Everything in this house was designed to remind its inhabitants of exactly how much they had to lose. Violet ate with the unhurried precision she had practiced. She asked about the Hartford business that had delayed James's return. She commented on the quality of the pheasant. She mentioned, briefly and without over-elaborating, a gallery she had visited in Lisbon, one she had read about extensively in the travel memoirs of a woman who had actually been there. She had learned early that the most convincing lies are built from borrowed truths. James listened. He responded when appropriate. He refilled his wine glass once and did not refill hers without asking. It was all perfectly civilized and completely unbearable. It was only as the second course was being cleared that he said, without looking up from the table, "Do you remember Dr. Harlan Webb?" Violet kept her hands still in her lap. "Of course," she said, because of course was almost always the right answer when you were pretending to remember things you had never known. "He's been appointed to the county medical board." James set his napkin beside his plate. "He mentioned last month that he'd seen you in the village, just before you departed for the continent. Said you looked pale." He was concerned. "I was unwell that winter," Violet said. "It passed." He said something else. James finally looked at her, directly, with those dark eyes that had a way of making the air in a room feel slightly thinner. "He said you had a mark on your face he hadn't noticed before, just below the left ear." Pause, measured and deliberate. "He found it curious, as your physician, that he hadn't noted it in his records." The candlelight moved between them like a third person at the table. "Old scars have a way of becoming visible as one ages," Violet said. Her voice was level. Her hands, beneath the table, were pressed flat against her thighs. "I'm sure his records are simply incomplete." James said nothing. He simply looked at her for one long moment, then pushed his chair back and wished her a good evening. She sat alone at the long table after he left and stared at the nearest candle flame until her eyes watered. Not from emotion, but from the deliberate, disciplined act of not blinking until she was certain she was alone. Then she stood, walked directly to the servants' staircase at the back of the house, and went to find the one person in Harrowfield Manor she had not expected to need this soon. His name was Edmund Graves, and he had been a footman at Harrowfield Manor for 11 years. Violet had known about Edmund before she arrived. His name appeared 3 times in the documents she had spent months assembling, each reference small and seemingly insignificant, the kind of detail that only matters when you know what you're looking for. She had made contact with him 6 weeks before her arrival, through an intermediary in the city, with a single written proposal and a sum of money that represented 4 years of his wages. He had accepted without negotiating, which told her either that he was desperate or that he already wanted what she was offering. Neither option made her fully comfortable. She found him in the lamp room at the back of the house, trimming wicks with the focused economy of someone who had done the same task 10,000 times. He looked up when she entered but did not appear startled. That too she noted. "He asked about the scar," she said without preamble. Edmund set down the trimming scissors. "How?" "Through a physician. Someone named Webb." She watched his face carefully. "Did you know Webb had mentioned seeing Constance before she left?" Something moved behind Edmund's eyes, not surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man recalculating. "Webb is on the county medical board. He and the Duke play cards on the second Thursday of every month." "I should have flagged that." "Yes," Violet said. "You should have." The silence between them was different from the silence at dinner. This one had weight. Edmund had provided her with the household staff list, the Duke's schedule, the layout of the private rooms, and 6 months of correspondence between James and his solicitors in Hartford. He had been, by every practical measure, indispensable. But standing across from him now in the dim lamp room, watching the way he had said "I should have flagged that" with the smooth, practiced tone of someone accustomed to managing other people's mistakes, she felt the first genuine tremor of doubt she had allowed herself since arriving. "Is there anything else you haven't told me?" she asked. Edmund met her gaze without flinching. "Nothing that matters yet." Yet, she filed that word away in the same part of her mind where she kept things she intended to return to. "The Duke is watching me more carefully than I anticipated," she said. "I need access to the East study, the locked drawer in his desk. That's a different arrangement than we discussed." "Then we're discussing it now." Edmund looked at her for a long moment, then picked up the trimming scissors again and returned to the lamp wicks. "Give me 3 days," he said, "and don't go near that study yourself. If he's already watching, the worst thing you can do is give him a direction to look." She left the lamp room without another word and made her way back through the servants' corridor, up the narrow staircase, and into Constance's room. The fire had burned low. The white flowers on the writing desk had begun to close for the night, their petals drawing inward like small, careful fists. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and allowed herself, for exactly 60 seconds, to feel the full weight of how precarious everything was. Then she picked up the journal, turned to a new page, and wrote Edmund's name at the top. Below it, she wrote one question. Not because she didn't have others, but because this one had been sitting in the back of her throat since the lamp room and needed somewhere to go. Who told him I was coming before I did? She stared at the question for a long time. Then she closed the journal, lay back on the bed fully dressed, and listened to the snow settle against the window glass in the long, cold silence of a house that was keeping more secrets than she had originally counted. 3 days passed and Edmund did not deliver. No word, no signal, no folded note left beneath the blue vase on the second-floor landing. The method they had agreed upon in the city, over a table in a narrow coffeehouse where the walls were close enough to ensure privacy and the noise loud enough to ensure anonymity. Violet checked the vase every morning before the household stirred and every evening before she retired, and every time she found nothing but the faint smell of dried flowers and dust. On the 4th morning she stopped checking. If Edmund had gone silent, there were only 2 explanations. He was being watched, or he had chosen a different arrangement than the one she had paid for. Either way, waiting for him was no longer a strategy. It was a surrender dressed up as patience. She made her move on a Tuesday, when the weather turned brutal enough to keep the household staff concentrated in the lower rooms, and James rode out to the eastern edge of the property with his steward to inspect storm damage to the boundary wall. She had learned his schedule not from Edmund but from simple observation, 3 mornings of watching from the upstairs corridor window, noting the precise time his horse cleared the iron gate, calculating how long a boundary inspection typically required in this kind of cold. 40 minutes. Perhaps 50 if the damage was extensive. She gave herself 30. The east study smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, with an undertone of something sharper, ink, perhaps, or the particular staleness of documents that had not been aired in some time. She moved to the desk without pausing to examine the room, because examining rooms was a luxury she did not have, and pulled the brass handle of the top drawer. Locked as Edmund had told her. She had not waited for Edmund to solve this. From the inside of her left sleeve she removed a narrow steel implement. Not a key, but a tool she had learned to use in a life so far removed from burgundy wool and bone china that thinking about it directly still felt like pressing a bruise. She worked quickly and without drama, and the lock gave in under a minute. Inside the drawer was exactly 1 item. Not a ledger. Not a contract. Not the correspondence from his Hartford solicitors that she had been building toward for the better part of 2 months. It was a photograph. In 1873, photographs were still rare enough to feel significant. Stiff, slightly formal, the subjects required to hold still long enough that spontaneity was impossible. This one showed 2 people standing in front of an iron gate not entirely unlike the one at the front of Harrowfield Manor. A man she did not recognize, heavy-set and dark-suited, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. And beside him, one hand resting on the gate post, a young woman of perhaps 17 or 18. The young woman was Violet Crane. Not the composed, carefully constructed version of herself that currently occupied this house. The earlier version. Thinner, younger, with her hair loose and her expression carrying the particular blankness of someone who has recently survived something they haven't yet found words for. She was wearing a servant's dress. Her chin was turned slightly to the left. Below her left ear, even in the faded gray tones of the photograph, the crescent scar was unmistakable. Violet stood at the desk with the photograph in both hands and felt the careful architecture of everything she had built begin to shift beneath her. Not collapse, not yet, but move, the way the floor of a ship moves when the water beneath it changes depth. James had not found the scar suspicious because he was a thorough man. He had recognized it because he had seen this photograph before she ever arrived. The question that followed was immediate and cold and far more frightening than anything Edmund's silence had suggested. Who had given it to him, and how long had they been ahead of her? She returned the photograph to the drawer, locked it, and left the study exactly as she had found it. Chair at the same angle, lamp at the same position, the faint indentation in the desk blotter undisturbed. She had learned long ago that the most important part of looking for something was ensuring no one could tell you had looked. She found James in the entrance hall when she came downstairs at noon, still in his riding coat, speaking in low tones with a man she had never seen before. The stranger was perhaps 60 years old, slight and precise in his movements, with silver hair and the kind of careful, unhurried eyes that Violet associated with lawyers and former soldiers. Men who had spent significant portions of their lives in rooms where saying the wrong thing had consequences. He carried a leather satchel worn smooth at the corners from long use. James saw her on the stairs and did not look away. "Constance," he said, with the same composed neutrality he had deployed all week. "This is Mr. Silas Beaumont. He's an old associate of your father's. He's passing through the county and I've invited him to stay for supper." Silas Beaumont turned and looked at her, and Violet understood, in the space of a single breath, that this man had not arrived by coincidence. The worn satchel, the precise eyes, the way he looked at her not with the casual appraisal of a stranger, but with the focused attention of someone confirming what they already expected to find. All of it assembled into a single, clarifying fact. He knew the real Constance Ashford. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, descending the last 3 steps with her chin at the correct angle and her hands perfectly still. "What a pleasant surprise." Silas Beaumont smiled, a small, careful smile that did not reach his eyes. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Your Grace." He paused just briefly enough to be deliberate. "You look remarkably well, considering everything." Considering everything. 2 words with a trapdoor built into them. She smiled back with equal precision and excused herself to change for supper, and the moment she turned away from both of them she felt the full, quiet pressure of the trap closing. Not around her ankles, not yet, but near enough that she could feel the cold of the metal. In her room she sat at the writing desk and did not open the journal. Instead she thought about Edmund, who had gone silent, about James, who had the photograph, about Silas Beaumont, who had arrived the same week that her access to the locked drawer had become urgent, about the letter James had received, the one she had not yet seen, but whose existence she had inferred from the shape of his behavior since the first night. She thought about the man in the photograph standing beside the younger version of herself, the heavy-set man in the dark suit whose face she had recognized with a lurch of cold recognition the moment she saw it, though she had trained herself not to show it. His name was Aldous Crane, her father, a man who had been dead for 6 years, according to every official record she had ever found. She pressed the tips of her fingers together and stared at the window where the winter light was already beginning to fail, and understood that she had not come to Harrowfield Manor ahead of the story. She had walked directly into the middle of one that had started without her. Supper with Silas Beaumont was an exercise in controlled demolition. The dining room held 3 people and approximately 4 times as many unspoken things, all of them circling the table like uninvited guests waiting to be acknowledged. Mrs. Dunning had arranged a modest spread: roasted lamb, root vegetables glazed in honey, fresh bread still warm enough to steam when broken. The kind of meal designed to suggest warmth and ease. It suggested neither. Silas sat across from Violet with his worn satchel tucked beside his chair, close enough to reach without standing, she noticed, and ate with the appetite of a man entirely unbothered by tension. He spoke about the county roads, about the difficulty of winter travel, about an acquaintance in Hartford whose name meant nothing to Violet and apparently very little to James. He was performing the role of the passing guest with considerable skill, and the skill itself was the warning. Violet matched him perfectly. She asked after his journey. She noted the improvement in the county's coaching inns since her time abroad. She laughed, once, at precisely the right moment, and the laugh was Constance's, light, controlled, never quite reaching the eyes. It was James who eventually moved the pieces. "Silas was your father's legal counsel for nearly 20 years, he said, setting down his fork with the quiet finality of someone closing a door. "He's been managing a particular matter of the Ashford estate that your father left unresolved at his death." "I'm aware of my father's estate," Violet said. "Are you aware?" Silas said pleasantly, reaching into the satchel beside his chair. Of the codicil he added to his will in the final year of his life? He placed a document on the table between them. Thick paper, closely written, sealed at one corner with wax that had been broken and carefully repressed. Violet looked at it without touching it. It stipulates, Silas continued, in the tone of a man reading weather reports, that in the event of Constance Ashford's death prior to producing an heir, the entirety of the Ashford holdings, the estate in Wiltshire, the northern properties, and the associated capital, reverts not to the Hereford line but to a secondary beneficiary. He paused. One whose identity your father kept sealed until the codicil's conditions were met. The lamb on Violet's plate had gone cold. She did not look at it. Constance is not dead, she said. The room went very still. It was the wrong thing to say, not because it was false, though it may well have been, but because it was reactive. Constance would have said, "I am sitting right here, Mr. Beaumont." She would have said it with faint amusement, as though the suggestion were mildly absurd rather than directly threatening. Violet had made the error of defending the wrong thing at the wrong moment, and she saw from the slight adjustment in Silas Beaumont's expression that he had noted it with the precision of a man paid to notice exactly that. James had not moved. He was watching her with his hands folded on the table and his dark eyes holding an expression she was only now learning to read. Not accusation, not triumph, but something that looked disturbingly close to concern. "No," Silas agreed, folding his hands to mirror James almost exactly. "She isn't." Another pause, longer this time, waited at both ends. "But she isn't in this room either, is she?" The candles between them burned without flickering. Somewhere in the back of the house, a door opened and closed, and the distant sound of it was the only movement in the world for what felt like a very long time. Violet set her napkin beside her plate. She looked at Silas Beaumont. She looked at James. And then she made the only calculation left to her. Not the one she had planned, not the careful, staged revelation she had constructed over months of preparation, but the raw, immediate decision of someone who has just watched their best exit close and must now choose which wall to walk through instead. "No," she said quietly. "She isn't." The confession, such as it was, did not unseal everything. Violet told them her name. She told them that Constance Ashford had not been harmed, that the real Duchess was, to the best of her knowledge, alive and residing under a different name in a village outside Marseille, having made the decision to disappear of her own free will, for reasons that were her own and that Violet had not been hired to question. She told them that she had assumed the identity not for financial gain, though she understood how it appeared, but to gain access to one specific document inside Hereford Manor that she had not yet found. She did not tell them about the photograph. She did not tell them about Aldous Crane. James listened to all of it without interrupting. Silas took notes in a small leather book with the detached professionalism of a man who had heard stranger confessions in quieter rooms. When she finished, the silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. Less like a held breath and more like the moment after one, when the lungs have released and the body hasn't yet decided what comes next. "What document?" James asked. It was the right question, and the fact that it was the first thing he asked, not "who are you" or "how dare you," but "what were you looking for," told her something important about him that she filed away with the same care she had given everything else. "A contract," she said, "executed in 1858, between a man named Aldous Crane and a senior member of the Ashford family." She watched James's face. "I believe your father-in-law signed it. I believe it concerned the transfer of a property in the north that had no legal right to be transferred, because it belonged, by prior deed, before the Ashford holdings were consolidated, to the Crane family." Silas had stopped writing. The quality of his stillness was different now. No longer the professional composure of a working solicitor, but the specific, too careful stillness of a man hearing something he had hoped would not be said aloud in his presence. Violet looked at him directly for the first time all evening. "You knew about the contract, Mr. Beaumont." It was not a question. Silas closed his leather book. The sound of it was very small and very loud. "I think," he said after a moment, "that this conversation has become one for the morning when clearer heads may." "You drafted it," Violet said. The candles burned. The lamb sat cold on the plates. James had not moved, but his eyes had shifted from Violet to Silas with the slow, deliberate quality of someone turning a key. Silas Beaumont said nothing. and his silence was the most complete answer in the room. Later, much later, after Silas had excused himself with the measured dignity of a man retreating rather than fleeing, and after Mrs. Dunning had come and gone with the quiet efficiency of someone trained not to register what she witnessed, James and Violet sat alone at the long table with the candles burning low between them. "The property," James said. "The one taken from the Crane family." He turned his wine glass slowly in his hand, an echo of the first night she had arrived and he had stood in the library doing exactly the same thing. "Is that why you came?" Violet looked at the last candle still burning between them, the flame small now, uncertain, doing its best against the dark. "I came," she said, "because the man who arranged that transfer also arranged my father's death." She paused. "And because 6 weeks ago I received a letter telling me the proof I needed was inside this house." She met his eyes. "The same week, I suspect, that you received a letter telling you I was coming." James set the wineglass down. "Who sent yours?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "Do you?" He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that the last candle guttered, caught itself and held. "No," he said. "But I think it's time we found out." Silas Beaumont was gone before dawn. Not fled. His bags were packed with the same precise care that characterized everything else about him. His room left immaculate. His breakfast declined through a note delivered to Mrs. Dunning in handwriting so steady it bordered on defiant. He had arranged a private coach, paid in advance, destination unrecorded. By the time Violet came downstairs at 6 in the morning, the only evidence that Silas had ever been at Harrowfield Manor was the faint smell of pipe tobacco in the guest corridor and the small leather book he had left, deliberately, she was certain, on the writing desk in his room. James found her standing in the doorway of the guest room, looking at the book without touching it. "He left it," she said. "I know." James stepped past her, picked it up, and opened it to the last written page. He read it once, then handed it to her without comment. The entry was dated the previous evening, written after supper in the same neat, pressureless hand as the note to Mrs. Dunning. It contained one name, one address in the city of Boston, and 4 words beneath them that Silas had underlined twice. "Do not go alone." They sat in the library for 2 hours that morning, the leather book open on the table between them, and for the first time since Violet had arrived at Harrowfield Manor, the conversation moved without armor. She told him about Aldous Crane, not the sanitized version she had offered at supper, but the real one. Her father, a land surveyor of modest means and meticulous records, who had spent 3 years documenting the chain of deed transfers in the northern counties and had built, document by document, an irrefutable case that the Ashford family had absorbed Crane land through a transaction that was, at its foundation, coerced. Aldous had presented his findings to a magistrate in the winter of 1867. 6 weeks later, he was dead. The official record said fever. Violet, who had been 17 and present in the house the night he died, had never believed it. She had spent 6 years building toward this moment. Learning the law from a retired solicitor in Providence who owed her a debt she had never cashed in until now. Learning Constance Ashford's mannerisms from a distance, at public functions, with the patience of someone who understood that preparation was the only advantage available to a person with no money and no name and nothing but the truth and a willingness to do almost anything to deliver it. James listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The photograph is on my desk," he said. "You found it?" "Yes. I didn't put it there to threaten you." He looked at the fire rather than at her, and she noticed that this was something he did when he was saying something that cost him something, directed his attention slightly away, as though the honesty required a degree of privacy even from the person receiving it. "I put it there because I needed to understand who you were before I decided what to do about it. And because whoever sent me that photograph wanted me to expose you immediately." He paused. "I chose not to." "Why?" He looked at her then. "Because the letter that came with it told me not to trust the photograph. That it was being sent by someone who wanted you removed from this house before you found what you were looking for." Another pause. "Which told me that what you were looking for was something worth protecting, worth hiding, worth sending a woman across the county in a dead Duchess's name to find." Violet stared at him. "You were protecting my search." "I was protecting the possibility that you were right," he said. There is a difference. The name written in Silas's leather book belonged to a man called Reverend Douglas Hale. Violet knew the name the moment she read it, though she had never connected it to the events surrounding her father's death. Reverend Hale was a figure of considerable moral standing in Boston, a churchman of the old school, white-haired and publicly beloved, known for his philanthropic works and his long association with several of the city's most prominent families. He had delivered the eulogy at the elder Ashford's funeral. He had sat on the board of 3 charitable institutions. He had, according to the social pages of the Boston papers that Violet had read in the Providence Library, been a trusted counselor to the Ashford family for over 30 years. She had been looking for a villain concealed in shadow. She had not thought to look at the man standing in the light. He was my father-in-law's confessor, James said when she showed him the name. Something moved across his face. Not quite a surprise, but the particular expression of a man watching a pattern complete itself. He was present at the signing of the Ashford estate consolidation in 1858. I always assumed as a witness. He set the book down. He wasn't witnessing it. He was orchestrating it. He needed the Crane land, Violet said. Not the Ashford family. They were instruments. He needed the specific parcel that my father's family held, the northern plot above the Harrow River. She had known this part for 2 years but had never understood the why of it until now, standing in the library with the pieces finally arranged in the right order. There's a mineral deposit, iron ore, substantial enough to supply 3 foundries for a decade. My father's survey identified it. That's what his records actually showed. Not just the deed irregularity. The ore. James was very still. Hale has been quietly acquiring foundry interests for 15 years, he said. It was not a question. He was assembling it alongside her, and the speed at which he did so told her that he had been sitting on pieces of this puzzle himself, without knowing what they connected to. And my father, Violet said, was the only person who had documented proof of who actually owned the land the ore sat beneath. The fire in the library grate had burned to deep red coals. Outside, the winter sky had gone the flat, pewter color that preceded heavy snow, and the light through the tall windows was thin and cold and entirely without warmth. Edmund Graves appeared in the library doorway. He was still in his footman's uniform, but something about the way he stood in the frame was different from every previous time she had encountered him. A subtle shift in posture, a loosening of the careful deference he had maintained since her arrival. He looked at Violet, then at James, and his expression carried the resigned quality of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment and has finally watched it arrive. I owe you an explanation, he said to Violet. You owe me considerably more than that, she said. Edmund stepped into the room. Reverend Hale has known about your investigation for 4 months. He has a man inside the Providence legal office where you've been working. When you made contact with me, I was already under instruction to report your movements. He paused. I did report them, for the first 3 weeks. And then, James said. Edmund looked at the fire. And then I read your father's survey, Miss Crane, the full version. Hale's man didn't know you had copied. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, heavy paper, covered in her father's meticulous handwriting, the edges worn from long concealment. I've been carrying it since October. I didn't know who to give it to until I understood what was actually at stake. Violet crossed the room and took the document from his hands. She did not open it. She already knew what it contained. But holding her father's words in her own hands after 6 years of searching, was something she had not prepared herself for, and the feeling of it moved through her chest with a force that had nothing to do with strategy. She pressed it flat against her palm and looked at Edmund with an expression she did not attempt to manage. Hale knows I'm here, she said. Yes, Edmund said, and he's already left Boston. His coach was seen on Hartford Road 2 days ago. He glanced at the window and the darkening sky beyond it. He'll be at Harrowfield by tomorrow evening. The coals in the grate shifted and settled with a soft, collapsing sound. James picked up the leather book, looked at the 4 underlined words one final time, and set it face down on the table. Then we have one night, he said. To be ready for him, they worked through the night by candlelight. James pulled every document from the East study that bore any connection to the 1858 consolidation: letters, receipts, deed transfers. A ledger so old its spine had cracked down the middle and been repaired with strips of brown paper. Edmund laid them across the library table in chronological order with the focused efficiency of a man making a final account of himself. Violet moved along the table with her father's survey open beside each document, cross-referencing in silence, the scratch of her pen the only sound in the room for long stretches at a time. It was past 2 in the morning when she found it. Not a dramatic discovery. No hidden compartment, no false bottom, no theatrical revelation. Simply a transfer receipt from November 1858, buried between 2 letters of correspondence so mundane that anyone without her father's survey as a guide would have set it aside without reading. The receipt documented the transfer of the Northern Harrow River parcel from Crane Holdings to the Ashford estate. It was signed by the elder Ashford, countersigned by his legal counsel, countersigned by Silas Beaumont, and witnessed, in a hand she had never seen before but that James identified without hesitation, by Reverend Douglas Hale. "He didn't just orchestrate it," James said quietly. "He signed his name to it. Which means the contract isn't just evidence of what was done to my father," Violet said. "It's evidence of what Hale did, directly, in his own hand." She looked up from the document. "He can't claim distance. He can't claim he was merely an advisor or a witness with incomplete knowledge. He was present, he was informed, and he signed." Edmund, standing at the end of the table, said nothing. He was looking at the receipt with the expression of a man watching something he has carried alone for a long time finally become visible to other people. Outside, the snow that had threatened all evening began to fall in earnest, thick and windless, the kind of snowfall that muffles the world into a strange, suspended quiet. Harrowfield Manor settled around them with the particular sounds of an old house at night, the creak and shift of timber and stone, the distant complaint of a shutter somewhere in the east wing. None of them slept. Reverend Douglas Hale arrived at 11:30 the following morning. He came in a private coach with no markings, accompanied by a single manservant, and he stepped out onto the frosted gravel of Harrowfield's entrance with the unhurried composure of a man paying a pastoral visit. White-haired, straight-backed, with a face that had been arranged by decades of public life into an expression of perpetual, benevolent calm. He looked like precisely what he had always presented himself to be, a man of God on the comfortable side of 70, carrying nothing more threatening than a Bible and a lifetime of good works. Mrs. Dunning showed him to the sitting room. James received him there, alone, while Violet waited in the adjoining room with the connecting door open by precisely 2 inches, enough to hear everything, enough to move quickly if required. Edmund was stationed at the end of the corridor with instructions that admitted no ambiguity. "James." Hale settled into the chair nearest the fire with the ease of a man accustomed to being welcome. "I came as soon as I heard you had an unexpected guest. I hope the situation hasn't caused you too much difficulty." "None at all," James said. He was standing near the window, hands clasped behind his back, and Violet recognized the posture. The same stillness she had catalogued on her first night, the patience of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and is in no particular hurry to do it. "I found her company remarkably illuminating." Something adjusted in Hale's expression, the benevolent calm flickering, just briefly, like a candle in a draught. "I imagine the deception must have been quite unsettling. A stranger in your own house, wearing your wife's name." He shook his head with measured sorrow. "I only hope Constance is safe wherever she is." "Constance is in Marseille," James said. "She's been there since September. We have an arrangement." He paused. "She left because I asked her to, because I needed someone to take her place, and the only person I trusted to do it was the one person with a reason strong enough to see it through." The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. In the adjoining room, Violet went completely still. "You knew," Hale said. The benevolence was gone now, not replaced by anger but by something colder and more precise, the expression of a man recalculating rapidly. "You arranged it." "I arranged for Violet Crane to find her way to Harrowfield," James said. I arranged for the documents she needed to be accessible. I arranged for Silas Beaumont to arrive and apply pressure at the right moment. He tilted his head slightly. What I did not arrange was you. You came on your own, which tells me you're more frightened than I estimated. Violet stepped through the connecting door. She had changed that morning into a dress of dark gray wool, not Constance's clothes, but her own, purchased in Hartford before she ever arrived at the manor. She was done with borrowed identities. She crossed the sitting room and set her father's survey and the 1858 transfer receipt on the table beside Hale's chair. And she looked at him with 6 years of accumulated clarity and said nothing at all. Hale looked at the documents. He looked at her face. He looked at the scar below her left ear with the recognition of a man seeing a ghost he had believed he had safely buried. Aldous Crane's daughter, he said. His only daughter, she said, who watched him die at 17 and spent the next 6 years learning exactly what you did and exactly how to prove it. She kept her voice even. Not cold, not triumphant, simply factual. The way her father had always spoken when he wanted a thing to be undeniable. The survey documents the or deposit and establishes prior Crane ownership of the land. The transfer receipt places you at the table when that ownership was stolen. And there is a retired magistrate in Providence who has been holding a sealed copy of both documents since October, with instructions to present them to the county court if he has not received word from me by the 1st of January. Hale was quiet for a long time. Outside the sitting room windows, the snow lay thick and unmarked across the grounds of Harrowfield Manor, white and clean and deceptive as it had been since the first morning. A horse moved somewhere in the stables. A coal shifted in the grate. "What do you want?" Hale said finally. Not a negotiation, a man taking inventory of what was left. "I want the Crane land formally restored," Violet said. "I want the foundry interests you've built on the proceeds of that or transferred to a public trust. And I want a signed confession, witnessed by the Duke of Harrowfield, that Aldous Crane's death in 1867 was not fever." The last item landed in the room with the quiet force of something that had been falling for a very long time finally reaching the ground. Hale looked at James. James looked back at him with an expression that offered nothing. The Reverend picked up the transfer receipt. He read it with the attention of a man searching for an exit he had already closed himself. Then he set it down, folded his hands in his lap, and in the measured, deliberate voice of a man who had spent 50 years controlling rooms, said, "You'll want a pen." The confession was signed before noon. Edmund witnessed it alongside James, his signature below the Duke's in the plain, careful hand of a man making the most honest record of himself he had managed in 11 years. Hale's coach left Harrowfield Manor an hour later, this time with 2 of James's men riding alongside it. Not as an escort, but as a reminder that the road to Boston was long and the sealed copy in Providence was already beyond anyone's reach. Violet stood at the entrance of the manor and watched the coach until it disappeared through the iron gates and the sound of it faded into the white silence of the countryside. James came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The cold was sharp and clean and honest in the way that cold always is. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, and there is a particular relief in that after a long time spent in rooms full of pretending. "Your father's survey," James said. "The magistrate in Providence. When did you put that in place?" "October," she said. "The same week Edmund made contact." She paused. "I needed to know that if everything went wrong inside this house, the truth would still get out." James nodded slowly. "And if I had exposed you the first night? If I had simply called for the magistrate and had you removed?" She considered that for a moment, the version of events where the door had opened differently, where the patience she had read in him had turned out to be something else entirely. "Then the sealed copy would have done its work without me," she said. "It was never only about me being here. It was about the documents existing somewhere they couldn't be buried again." She glanced at him sideways. "You were the variable I couldn't fully predict. And now," she looked back at the iron gate, at the place where the coach had been, at the long white road stretching away from Harrowfield Manor toward a world that was not fixed, not clean, but at least fractionally more honest than it had been yesterday. "Now," she said, "I have to find Constance Ashford and tell her she can come home." James was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone of a man raising something carefully, the way you raise a lamp in a dark room, slowly, to see what the light finds before committing to it, he said, "Marseille is a long journey in winter." Violet looked at him. "It is," she said. He said nothing more. But when she turned to go back inside, he held the door open, and the gesture was small and deliberate and entirely without pretense. The kind of thing a man does not when he is performing courtesy, but when he has simply decided, without announcement, which side of a door he intends to be on. She stepped through. The iron gates of Harrowfield Manor stood open behind them, and the snow kept falling, and somewhere on a road heading toward Boston, a man who had spent 50 years building a monument to his own virtue was finally being asked to account for its foundation. And in a village outside Marseille, a woman named Constance Ashford was sitting by a window, waiting for word that it was safe to be herself again. The story was not over. It had only finally begun to be honest. If this story found its way to your heart, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Every story begins here, and every time you share it, it reaches a little further.